We're excited to present about this study today. But one thing before we go into the presentation, we wanted to highlight that the study is going to be published in an article next week. So we ask you during this next week, please do not publish the results. They're meant to be presented here in this forum, but they're not to be shared or put into the public before the release of the article. And with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about rehydration of children with severe acute malnutrition. So as Lizzie already began to talk about, gastroenteritis, vomiting, and diarrhea is commonly seen in children with severe acute malnutrition, also known as SAM. And it's often associated with very poor outcomes, with these children often going on to develop severe dehydration, and a lot of them having a high mortality as high as 21%. It's been historically challenging to rehydrate these children because they believe that children with malnutrition and gastroenteritis, due to their fragility, cannot tolerate getting IV fluids. The main concern is that if we give them IV fluids, historically, that their hearts would not be able to tolerate that, and they would go into heart failure. There was also concerns about them being able to manage electrolytes or have very big switches in their electrolyte balance while they're dehydrated. They're also often very sick, so that complicates their management. So recommendations on their management has typically been very conservative. They often differ from what we say for children without malnutrition. Specifically, they are restrictive of IV fluids, saying that they should not be given to children who have severe acute malnutrition and dehydration, rather to use oral rehydration to rehydrate them. And these recommendations have been based on expert opinion, based on these concerns that I already mentioned. The concern for electrolyte derangements has also come through in the recommendations that we have for children with severe acute malnutrition, and has led to the fabrication of Risomal, which is a rehydration solution, oral rehydration solution for the children with malnutrition, and that's given instead of the standard WHO ORS solution, with the goal to avoid electrolyte problems. Risomal specifically has lower sodium and potassium than standard ORS. So the GASTROSAM study that we're presenting today is trying to investigate this particular problem, how to best rehydrate children with malnutrition. We have previous reassuring data on the cardiac function in children with severe acute malnutrition. So now we wanted to investigate whether IV fluids can be safely given for rehydration for children with severe malnutrition and severe dehydration, and whether the standard ORS, which we've avoided in the past in lieu of the Risomal, can be given also safely. We hypothesized in our study that the liberal rehydration strategies, meaning us giving IV fluids for severe dehydration and using ORS as compared to Risomal, may reduce adverse outcomes related to mortality and morbidity, and may improve time to recovery of children with severe acute malnutrition.
Okay, moving on to the design of the trial. We recruited children with SAM and diarrhea aged 6 months to 12 years with either severe or moderate dehydration. So those with severe dehydration were randomized to one of 3 different rehydration strategies. So we had the control arm, which is the current standard of care, where they get a bolus if they're in shock and no other IV rehydration. So the gray boxes are showing the treatments if they're in shock, and then the white boxes are what they get after treatment for shock or if they're not in shock. So that's our control arm. And then we had our 2 strategies that we're calling the liberal strategies, where they do receive IV rehydration. So one of these is Plan C, which is the standard of care for children that don't have SAM. And then we also had a slower IV rehydration strategy. And our main comparison was comparing the control to both of these strategies combined. So then we had a randomization between the 2 types of oral rehydration, the Risomal or the standard ORS, and this comparison included both the severe and some dehydration groups. Our primary outcomes were mortality at 96 hours for the IV rehydration comparison, and for the oral rehydration, it was change in sodium at 24 hours. And the sample size was to give us 80% power, assuming that we had 58% mortality in the control arm, and there was a 30% relative reduction in the liberal arms. And for our outcome of change in sodium, we had more than 90% power to detect a difference of 3 millimoles. This map is showing our trial sites. So we had sites in Kilifi and Coast General in Kenya, Mbale and Soroti in Uganda, and then we had the 2 MSF sites, Magaria and Maiduguri. We recruited 415 children in total, which was 272 that were severely dehydrated and 143 with some dehydration. So all 415 were included in the comparison of the RESA-MEL versus ORS. And we'll present results for each of those comparisons separately. And this is a graph of recruitment. So the trial started back in 2019, recruited a few patients, and then there was a long stoppage during the COVID pandemic. And then recruitment did reopen, but quite slowly until MSF joined the trial, and back at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, and then we managed to complete recruitment and meet our target.
So just to describe a little bit of the baseline characteristics of the children who were enrolled in the study. From here on, we'll be comparing children who were in the standard of care WHO SAM arm to the children who received IV fluids who are in the liberal arms of the study. So these are not all the baseline characteristics, but I wanted to highlight a few key ones that might be interesting going forward. The first one is that the population that we had in the study were mostly young, with a median age of the children at 13 months, so a lot of them were below 2 years old. You can also notice that a lot of them were very sick, with them having signs that showed there were circulatory impairment or problems with circulation. So weak pulse, some with hypotension, capillary refill, and prolonged tachycardia. You can also see, as we expected, that there were electrolyte derangements, specifically low sodium, with about 50% of the children we saw having that as one of the findings at baseline when they were enrolled in the study. So to highlight a little bit of the clinical management during the study, the first thing I wanted to point out was that there was very good adherence in the study teams to the protocol that was put to them, meaning that if there was a child who was meant to receive IV fluids, they received it. It was just under 100% of the children who were randomized received fluids according to how they were randomized. We also saw about 10% of the patients presenting with shock at admission, and they were treated according to the arm of the study, in those gray boxes that we showed. And they received boluses or received IV fluids depending on what that protocol, what the arm of the study dictated for them. Another thing to highlight is that for the WHO SAM arm, where they're not meant to receive IV fluids at admission, we noted that about 13% of them went on to require and receive IV fluids in the first 24 hours after their initial evaluation and management. This was typically because they developed shock after the initial few hours, or some other severe adverse event that required them to be treated with IV fluids. Also, I wanted to highlight that in the WHO SAM arm, there were way more patients who required NG tubes to be placed to rehydrate them orally versus in the liberal arms of the study. There was also a lot more vomiting in the WHO SAM arm as compared to the liberal arms of the study.
Okay, so moving on to our primary outcome. This is for the comparison of the liberal versus standard of care rehydration in the severely dehydrated children. And all analyses in this trial followed intention to treat principle. So overall mortality in this severely dehydrated group was around 7% at 96 hours. So we had 11 deaths in the control arm and 9 in the liberal arms. And the adjusted risk ratio was 1.02. This is adjusted for site, but we had a wide confidence interval. So we were aiming to show that the liberal strategies were superior, and we found that there was no difference, although because the overall mortality was much lower than we had assumed, the power to detect a difference was quite low. And at 28 days, we had overall mortality of 11%, and again, this wasn't a significant difference between the arms. And the graph here is showing mortality to 28 days over time.
Looking further at the results, The other thing we looked at very closely was were the outcomes linked to heart failure, so pulmonary edema and signs of heart failure. And we looked at those very closely because that was the major concern and the reason why previous guidelines have been restrictive. And when we looked at that across all the arms, we found that there were no reports of signs of pulmonary edema or other signs of heart failure across any of the arms throughout the study. We also looked at the other severe adverse events, and we didn't see any difference in any of the in the rate of severe adverse events across the arms, which shows that there was no extra hidden arms in any of the arms of the study that we looked at. When we also looked at the electrolytes, we did note that for this severe dehydration part, there was a difference in the change in sodium and potassium among the rehydration arms. Specifically, at the 8-hour mark, there was sodium corrected faster for the children who were given IV fluids versus in the WHO-SAM arm. But this we'll see later on ends up becoming minimal after 24 hours after continued rehydration with oral solutions. So in looking at the severe rehydration part of the study, in comparing the rehydration strategies, liberal with IV fluids versus standard of care, we did not see any evidence of difference in mortality among the different groups that were receiving different rehydration strategies. Of course, as Roshin mentioned, the overall mortality was much less than we anticipated, and that was predicted from literature, which was different than our hypothesis. This is a limitation of the study, though it's good for our patients. This difference is probably associated with the study environment itself that we were working in, where there was, for the study period, closer monitoring, dedicated staff to care for the patients, and us actively searching for the complications among the patients who were recruited to the study during this period. This is a lesson in and of itself that requires further reflection. Also, I wanted to highlight that in searching for these other potential risks and harms, especially the ones related to fluid overload and heart failure, we didn't see any difference in severe adverse events between the arms, nor did we see the thing we feared the most, fluid overload events, across any of the patients who were in the study.
So now looking at the comparison of the two oral rehydration solutions, the RESOMAL versus ORS, and our primary outcome was change in sodium. And we had good completeness of the sodium for this primary outcome. And in both arms, at 24 hours, sodium had increased by approximately 5 millimoles, and there was no evidence of a difference between the arms. And at 28 days, we had a mortality of 10%. Again, no evidence of a difference. Oh, and there was no further evidence of pulmonary edema or heart failure in this bigger group either. So in conclusion, for the oral rehydration, there was no evidence of a difference in change in sodium at 24 hours, but there were also no safety concerns from using the standard ORS in this population.
So taking both the IV rehydration and oral rehydration parts of the study together, what can we conclude? First, though, the first thing we can say is that while there was no difference in mortality between the groups due to the low number of mortality events, we can see that there is no evidence of harm with giving IV fluids for rehydration for children with severe acute malnutrition and severe dehydration, nor is there evidence of harm with using standard ORS solutions instead of RESOMAL for children with moderate dehydration. These findings for us are pretty important in getting more insight into how we continue to care for these populations, especially in the context where MSF works, and they can hopefully inform our future guidelines, including ways for us to simplify the rehydration protocols between malnourished and non-malnourished patients specifically. We also saw very good adherence to the research protocol, which I would like to highlight as an amazing achievement, especially for the MSF, Magare, and Maiduguri teams who are conducting a randomized control trial for the very first time, and in situations that were often challenging with the peak season, floods, protests, and they did this with the highest quality and did this with some of the sickest patients. Of course, this study is adding to a body of evidence that we already mentioned is very little, and is a key addition to this limited body of evidence, and we are glad that we have played a part in doing that too. So I'll end by saying that this study was a big effort across many actors, and it was huge, and we are from different organizations presenting today just to illustrate that. So we want to thank all of the people who were involved and acknowledge them, especially the patients and their families.